and thank you all for being here tonight, for making the journey. Thank you for the Australian Institute of International Affairs for their interest in my research and for inviting me to talk about my research tonight. It is a great pleasure to be here. And thanks to the people who made this event possible, including Alistair Roth, Alicia Turner, Dr. Patricia Salas, and Jacob Chick for coordinating. So before I go into this presentation, I too wish to do my acknowledgement of country, and I wish to acknowledge that we are meeting on the stolen land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also wish to pay my respect to any First Nations person here in the room or anyone online. I also wish to acknowledge and thank the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition for publishing the report on which I will be presenting tonight. The report is available on the internet on the link provided on the slide, if you're interested to read the full report. The Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition is a research and advocacy group that was established in 2021 and is convened by the International Women's Development Agency. Last year, they established an issue paper series, which is a bi-monthly publication, which explores the practical implications of feminist foreign policy in relation to a variety of topics. So my paper is part of this series. Nonetheless, I wish to say that the views that I express tonight and are in the paper are my own and my collaborator, and not the network's. I also wish to acknowledge my collaborator, Patricia Sango-Pollard, who is an expert in gender in Solomon Islands and also an independent researcher in Honiara. And Patricia has provided insights into the perspectives of women in the Solomon Islands and Honiara, and is also conducting further research on the topic for this project at the moment. I also wish to thank La Trobe University for funding this project. Okay, so how did I get here? So I got into this research by observing the increasingly assertive presence of China in the Pacific and how that is pushing militarization in the region. I also observed that countries like China, Australia, and the Solomon Islands, among others, have been engaging in military diplomacy more and more often. So military diplomacy refers to the bilateral and multilateral relations that are premised on military considerations and cooperation. I have compiled a list to demonstrate what I mean by this. So the first example is, of course, AUKUS, which has been on the news quite significantly recently. This is a self-evident example of military diplomacy, where Australia has entered in a defense alliance with the US and UK to receive nuclear-powered submarines and strengthen defense alliance primarily with the United States. Another example is the deployment of the Australian Defence and Police in Honiara in Solomon Islands in November 2021, which activated for the first time the 2017 bilateral treaty between Australia and the Solomon Islands that was signed after RAMSI. So this is the regional assistance mission in Solomon Islands that was led by Australia during the so-called period of detention. So this was a period of unrest and conflict in the Solomon Islands. Domestically in the Solomon Islands, the government of Malaita, which is a region of the Solomon Islands, opposed this intervention because they saw it as favoring what they perceived to be an anti-democratic government of Mr. Sogovara. Another glaring example of militarization and military diplomacy is the security pact between China and the Solomon Islands that was leaked last year in March. This has been a crucial factor of insecurity and instability in the region and has catalyzed even more competition between great powers in the Pacific. Following the leak of the defense pact between China and the Solomon Islands, relations between Australia and the Solomon Islands soured. Australia accused the Solomon Islands of inviting great power competition in the Pacific and feared about the possible proximity of China to the Australian territory. Solomon Islands said pretty much the same about Australia and AUKUS, accusing Australia of inviting power competition in the region, and also accused Australia of interfering in its sovereign politics. Since the election of the Albanese government, however, Australia has been trying to repair relations with the Solomon Islands and also other Pacific nations. And in November 2022, the Australian Defence signed a contract to enhance Solomon Island security capabilities, which, among other provisions, included the extension of the presence of the Australian police and military in Honiara to support public order in preparation of the Pacific Games in 2022. As part of this agreement, Australia will also support Solomon Islands in upgrading military infrastructures that enable Solomon Islands to increase its patrolling capabilities. A final example of militarization in relation to Australia can be found in the national budget that was released early this week. So this revealed that almost $2 billion over the next 5 years will be directed to the Pacific, of which 1.4 billion will be in the area of defense. So basically, Australia is signaling to Pacific nations that if they're looking for defense cooperation, we should be the partner of choice rather than China. So because Australia's renewed interest in the Solomon Islands and Pacific region stems from the defense pact between China and the Solomon Islands, as well as a more assertive presence of China in the Pacific, it is not surprising that military diplomacy is at the forefront of Australia's bilateral and multilateral relations in the Pacific. And while for many, the Pacific is mostly a chessboard, militarization and military diplomacy are negatively affecting Pacific women. So AUKUS is a challenge to the Treaty of Rarotonga, which establishes the South Pacific as a nuclear-free zone. Pacific women were and are at the forefront of the anti-nuclear movement. Therefore, this maneuver disrespects Indigenous Pacific voices that have fought to achieve a nuclear-free South Pacific, and disregards Pacific women's activism in international relations and foreign policy. Women's activism for a nuclear-free Pacific and world has been driven by their experiences with food contamination, cancer, and reproductive health issues related to nuclear testing. They've also emphasized the nuclear politics as advanced patriarchal logics that dismiss women's concern about public health with defense rationalities. Most of the high diplomacy that is going on in the Solomon Islands at the moment is not to the benefit of women. Notably, China's check diplomacy, which is the use of economic incentives to promote diplomatic relations, does not reach local women. We know this, for example, from the reporting of Ruby Awa, who is a gender and human rights consultant in the Solomon Islands, who put under scrutiny the fact that while the government is handing over money to the Chinese investors to build houses that do not comply with building codes and livable standards, hospitals do not have enough beds, medicines, and medical staff. Similarly, Australia's military diplomacy is likely to reduce local women to targets of military and security training and recruitment. As far as I am aware, there is no provision in place to work out what civilian women's groups need and how defense can support their already existing operation in civilian fields. We also know that the Australian intervention in Honiara in 2021 did not include gender military advisors, despite the fact that academics like Nicole George and Solomon Islander journalists such as Georgina Kakea show the costs of the riots for local women, including the physical and the psychological risks that they face following the unrests. So this is a topic that I'm actually currently exploring further with the help of Patricia Sango. Nicole George also noted that despite the Malayan women have insisted to be part of the dialogue and conversation about peace building following the riots, we don't have any evidence that they've been included. Instead, the response to the riots has been largely militaristic with soldiers on the ground. Finally, there is a sense that in Australia's gender development projects in the Pacific, women are mostly treated as recipients of aid rather than actors of local and regional politics. In the publication, I discussed some of the figures relating to the Australian Women Development Project in the Pacific, and specifically in the Solomon Islands. I find that the bulk of the money went to ending violence against women, which is absolutely a priority, but it is not enough to elevate women as political leaders and actors. On the flip side, it is important to say that the new Women's Development Project, Pacific Women Lead, which when I last checked in March, it was still under design, will focus on issues including the promotion of women's leadership, the realization of women's rights, and the support of regional efforts and partnerships to achieve gender equality. So there seems to be more of an emphasis on the empowerment of women as political actors, at least locally. It will be interesting to see if this will extend to regional politics and also foreign policy, not only between Pacific nations, but also with Australia, New Zealand, and the US at the very least. So there is a sense that when things get geostrategically difficult, women get sidelined or made into instruments of politics. And when we don't like what they say, we politely put them aside. Therefore, we need a stronger framework to promote gender equality and women in foreign policy, and to include them, as in us, in the geopolitical conversations and actions pertaining peace and security. To be clear, there already exists a framework, an international framework to advance women's leadership in politics and security. This was formally established in 2000 with the UN Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is a framework that was created by the UN in consultation with civil society to promote the participation of women in post-conflict reconstruction and security, and for the protection of women and girls in and after conflict. So this framework recognizes that women and girls are disproportionately affected by conflict, and their voices and experiences are often ignored in peace processes. It also recognizes the research which shows that the participation of women in conflict resolution produces more stable peace. Women bring to the table a different set of considerations and a stronger focus on human rights and community cohesion. Another mechanisms that promote gender and women in peace and security are the national action plans on women, peace and security. These are policy frameworks that are adopted by states as well as multilateral organizations to ensure the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. As of February 2023, we had 105 national action plans, including from regional organizations such as the League of Arab States, the European Union, and the Economic Community of West African States. So national action plans are quite different across the board, but generally speaking, the research shows they can be outwarded oriented, and so they focus on pursuing the Women, Peace and Security agenda as a matter of foreign policy, or they can be inward oriented, and therefore they articulate the Women, Peace and Security as a matter of domestic politics and affairs. The growing number of states which have adopted national action plans on women, peace, and security is a testament to the growing presence of gender equality in norms gender equality norms in foreign policy, and the recognition that national and international security are linked to women's security and the participation of women. It is within this context and framework that feminist foreign policy emerged as a commitment to women and gender mainstreaming in foreign policy specifically. So feminist foreign policy can be defined as an approach which transforms foreign policy to benefit women and girls and aims to make gender equality and women's rights central objective of foreign policy. Feminist foreign policy advances an ethical commitment to increase the meaningful participation of women in policymaking, security, and diplomacy, and empower women's groups, initiatives, and networks, that is civil society, advance gender mainstreaming in policymaking with considerations of intersectional identity categories such as race, sexuality, class, ability, nationality, and age. Promote girls and women's leadership, develop international framework and assistance programs that target women and girls' needs and insecurity, again, with an intersectional framework in mind. And finally, facilitate men and boys becoming agents of gender norm transformation and the dismantlement of patriarchal structures. So it envisions also the inclusion of men and boys. So I like to think of feminist foreign policy as a question that guides foreign policy. And this question is, so is the policy in the area of diplomacy, defense, security, aid, trade, climate security, and immigration benefit women? And if so, does it benefit women taking into account their differences? So what countries have a feminist foreign policy? So the first country that announced a feminist foreign policy was Sweden in 2014. And this was made possible by the vision and boldness of this Swedish Foreign Minister for Foreign Affairs, Margot Wallström. Unfortunately, Sweden recently dropped the commitment to a feminist foreign policy, but other countries pursued or followed on the footsteps of Sweden, including Canada, France, Mexico, Luxembourg, Spain, Libya, Chile, Germany, the Netherlands, Liberia, Colombia, and more recently, Slovenia and Belgium. So these are all countries that in a way or another have made a commitment to pursue a feminist foreign policy, which notably looks very different from country to country. Australia doesn't have a feminist foreign policy, but has an outward-oriented national action plan. I will say a bit more on the case of Australia in a second, but for now I want to talk about the reasons why states and organizations adopt gender-promoting strategies in their foreign policy. So both national action plans that are outwarded and they are oriented outside, as well as a feminist foreign policy. So on a very practical level, gender equality is a goal of the Sustainable Development Goals to achieve a more sustainable and equitable world by 2030. As the data tells us, the situation of women and girls around the world remains a matter of concern, especially when considering the literature which shows that gender inequality and violence are correlated to political violence and instability. So here is some data for us to consider. 60% of the chronically hungry people around the world are women and girls. More than 2/3 of the women's illiterate population are women. And women and girls are increasingly targeted for sexual violence as a weapons of war. So when states and organizations opt into the framework, international framework to mainstream gender in peace and security, they often do this with this data in mind, and they have a commitment to eradicate gender equality. They might also have other normative commitments and reasons, such as wanting to address the longstanding underrepresentation of women in foreign policy and security, and wanting to affirm their commitment to human rights and human security, and express their concern for human life. Concerns and actions, I would say. So some states might also come with a more strategic mindset, in which case they opt in the international framework to advance women because of the recognition that there are strategic benefits involved. So these include the fact that the inclusion of women improves peace, security, stability, and economic growth. So they might also be thinking about the fact that strengthening the opting into these international frameworks strengthen the liberal international order, as well as the framework, the international framework of gender mainstreaming. So it's a way to uphold the international liberal order. For middle power states, opting in the international framework of gender mainstreaming is a way to accrue soft power and influence in the international sphere. So it's basically a way of, it's a practice of nation branding revolving around a widely recognized and shared political cause. And finally, some states do that in order to comply and to avoid troubles and too much talking about other policies that might be going on domestically or internationally. So in my research, I argue that feminist foreign policy ought to be seen more explicitly as a tool of peace building. This is evident in the definition of feminist foreign policy provided by the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, which goes like this. Feminist foreign policy is an approach which places gender equality as the central goal of foreign policy, in recognition that gender equality is a predicator of peaceful and flourishing societies. Oftentimes, when we think about peace building, we understand the practical projects undertaken to promote the economic and societal reconstruction of a society after conflict. And we also tend to associate the practice with the United Nations. For those who are more familiar, they might be thinking about the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, as well as the Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Funding. So these are organizations where basically like states contribute towards a multilateral effort for peace building. Less often we think about peace building as a matter of states' foreign policy. But states can promote international peace building more directly. And of course, the instrument is their foreign policy. However, there is a tendency to conceive of foreign policy as a matter of geopolitical strategy that prioritizes defense and economic gains. But if foreign policy stokes competition and conflict, what's even the point of international peace building in the first place? A report produced by the Initiative for Peacebuilding at the University of Melbourne and published in 2017 offers an analysis of how states can contribute to peace building. The report concludes that states have the responsibility to institutionalize peace building and conflict resolution in their foreign policy, and they provide 4 recommendations. First, governments must provide clear leadership in promoting peace building, such as ministries and policies. Secondly, states must support independent research and expertise that can be used by policymakers. Thirdly, states must map their network of local and international actors and non-governmental organizations that can support informal peace processes and provide early warning and responses to emerging crises. And finally, states must engage in coordinated multilateral efforts to build peace, such as the UN and other regional organizations. So I argue that a feminist foreign policy is an explicit articulation of feminist foreign policy to promote peace building, especially because gender equality and the empowerment of women are correlated with a more peaceful society. Women bring to the table different considerations that, when addressed, make up for a more comprehensive peace. They also bring a different set of negotiation skills and a different cohort of people that they are connected with. So coming to Australia, in general, Australia has a pro-gender foreign policy guided by policies such as the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, the second iteration of which was released in April 2021, which shows that there is a commitment or a renewed commitment to women in peace and security. There is also the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's 2016 Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Strategy, which perhaps is a bit outdated, but it's still there. And there are also provisions about gender equality in defense, mostly in terms of staffing and management of internal affairs. Defense also has gender military advisors to ensure compliance with the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security in deployment as well. However, Australia never made a commitment to feminist foreign policy. Because of this lack of commitment, Australia is often pulled into muscular politics, instrumentalizes gender equality to pursue other policies or politics, and we're not always using foreign policy as a tool of peace building. In a recent index that I've come across just today, actually, Australia is ranked number 9 in measures of militarizations, where where the number 1 is the most militarized. So just to give you a sense of how they compile this index, the indicators that they've used are the volume of arms transfers, military expenditures, the ratio of health and education spending to military expenditure, and the ratification of key disarmament normative frameworks, and finally, the adoption of a national action plan that is fully costed and also includes provisions about both foreign and domestic affairs. For those interested, the list goes: Israel was the first, as in the most militarized, followed by the US, India, Norway, South Korea, the UK, France, China, and then finally us, Australia. So the declaration of a feminist foreign policy would be a clear direction and indication that Australia's foreign policy aims to advance peace building as well as gender equality. Australia's pro-gender foreign policy is mostly confined or focused to aid and development, which as evidenced in the budget that was just released, is not a large section of the Australian's budget. So I haven't done the math just yet, but I rate the defense has been allocated at 2.4% of the budget, and that the budget to international aid and development has increased slightly, just a tiny bit. And the last time that I checked, it was only 0.18% of the budget, which is tiny. So Australia's pro-gender foreign policy is a clear, although quite limited in scope, is a clear normative commitment to gender equality, and to a large extent is also driven by strategic considerations to include women because of the benefit of producing more peace and stability. It's also a way to uphold the rule-based international order, and it's also a way for Australia to project soft power as a middle power state. In an analysis of Australia's foreign policy documents, Catherine Liku finds that the language of pro-gender norms is established as an identity marker, which provides a mutually reinforcing description of who Australia is and how it intends to conduct itself in the world. However, Liku also argues that Australia's pro-gender foreign policy is limited in scope, so as I said before, aid and development, and it's still secondary to other foreign policy priorities, including defense, trade, and especially arms trade. We need to talk about that. Refugee policies and military intervention. Liku also argues that Australia's pro-gender foreign policy has been achieved by stealth because domestic politics and the defense and foreign policy portfolios continue to be dominated by conservative and masculinized politics that prioritize men, defense strategy, and competition among states. The latest demonstration of this is that there is no mention to women in the defense strategic review, which also deprioritize human assistance and climate security. So the masculine culture and politics that hold back the announcement of a feminist foreign policy are important to note, because despite the fact that women in Australia have achieved high positions in government, and most of them consider themselves to be feminist, they are reluctant to use the word feminism in their conduct of politics and policy. And the reason being that feminism is still considered to have a negative connotation within a highly masculinized culture, such that which surrounds the high politics of Australia. So this is important to note because research finds that feminist foreign policy happens not as a result of elections, but because of bold women in government. So if the women in government can be bold about their feminism, then we're probably very unlikely to see a feminist foreign policy announced in Australia. Okay, so finally, what can an Australian feminist foreign policy do in the Solomon Islands and the Pacific? So here are a few suggestions that I make. So first of all, a feminist foreign policy can strengthen the norm of gender equality and more broadly signal a commitment to the rule-based international order found on the principles of human dignity, non-discrimination, and the rule of law. This is particularly important in the context in which China is trying to disrupt and redraw the international order with its muscles. And if we flex the muscles too, especially if this flexing goes at the expense of human dignity, then we become complicit in redrawing the international boundaries, the international order, like countries such as China want. So secondly, a feminist foreign policy can increase Australia's soft power and international image and standing. So by announcing a feminist foreign policy, Australia could create new partnership with other states that also have a feminist foreign policy and could become a hub in the Pacific for the promotion of women's rights. It could become a place where countries and organizations around the world, and above all in the Pacific, come to organize and coordinate projects to promote gender equality in the Pacific. Furthermore, women in the Pacific has demonstrated that they want empowerment and peace, which are things that China cannot offer them. And Australian feminist foreign policy will signal to them that Australia is their partner of choice. And when empowered, these women can make a difference in regional politics from the national and local basis. Thirdly, a feminist foreign policy will enshrine a commitment to treat Pacific women as interlocutors in the conversation about state building, regional stability and politics, and foreign policy. This would mean creating more channels for consultation with women on topics that go beyond domestic violence, and this plan in the realm of state, regional, and global politics as well. So what I mean here is that ending violence against women is absolutely important, but we also need to make the next step to empower women as political actors. And finally, a feminist foreign policy will strengthen the indigenous diplomacy agenda, which was announced last year by the Albanese government and will promote, hopefully, a decolonial politics. Because of its focus on intersectionality, a feminist foreign policy is an instrument that lifts indigenous women, brings them to a high level of negotiation and decision-making, and empower them to shape their own direction, not only domestically, but also regionally and internationally. So here I've got a few credits and a selected bibliography if you are interested in the topic. Of course, there is a more extensive bibliography in the report. And if you have any questions about the bibliography, I would be more than happy to share. Again, I would like to thank Patricia Sango-Pollard, who is my collaborator in this project. I also wish to thank the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, and especially Liz Gio Atkinson and Alice Ridge. And finally, again, wish to thank La Trobe for funding this project. Thank you, and I'll leave here my email address in case you have any questions that you want to direct to me more directly. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up here real quick and maybe pop my head into frame for those online on Zoom. We're going to do a quick round of questions for those that might have them. That also includes our online audience. Again, thank you to Dr. Caso for taking the time to join us this evening and aligning us on a topic of foreign policy that I think is undervalued and untouched by a lot of mainstream conversations. So to get the ball rolling on questions, I might actually start with one, and then we're going to move to the audience. So feel free to put your hand up and one of our volunteers will come around with a roving mic. But to begin, I'll just be interested in asking that you mentioned some of our competitors in the Pacific region in terms of our relationship with countries through that area. And I was just curious if any of those competitors, and not necessarily just China, but also other actors in the Pacific region, have taken any steps towards a feminist foreign policy or anything that might be heading in that sort of direction.
Yeah, and I mean, the simple answer is no. No, and I think that that is also why Australia should take the lead in taking on a feminist foreign policy, because although there were some conversations about ASEAN trying to formulate a like a feminist approach to foreign policy, that didn't come to fruition. And so if Australia were to take this step, they would be at the forefront of the conversation and practice. And that's why I think it would establish Australia as a hub in the Pacific to promote gender equality and the norm of gender equality.
Hi, thank you very much for that very interesting report. I'm wondering if you've mentioned the Albanese government. I'm wondering if you have any insights into Penny Wong's faction or her own opinions on how Australia should be looking at our future foreign policy.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't have any insights about her personal views, but perhaps there is something to be said about how she is conducting foreign policy and the things that she says. So I would say that in general, she's pro-gender in all areas. But I think that she's just not prioritized this area or this formulation, I would say. So I think that she is prioritizing a pro-gender approach, especially thinking about diversity. But she's not been willing to go as far as announcing or wanting to announce a feminist foreign policy. You know, there is something to be said about the fact that Australia has made a commitment to Indigenous diplomacy, which I think that they should work in tandem, as in a feminist foreign policy and Indigenous diplomacy should work in tandem. So it's great that they've made the step towards Indigenous diplomacy, and they are already starting to face the challenges of what does it actually mean. And I think that if they were to go down the route of announcing a feminist foreign policy, they would face similar questions. So, I mean, I want to be positive, and yeah, I think that there are good reasons to believe that you know, they're not sidelining gender as a norm of and guiding principle of foreign policy, but they just haven't made the commitment to go as far as claiming or wanting to announce a feminist foreign policy.
Hello, thank you very much. Really interesting talk. I come from more the aid and development side, so I was involved in the precursor for the Water for Women Fund. So as you're saying, there's a lot of focus on gender equality in the aid and development area. I'm interested in the operationalization of this. So for example, if we take Solomon Islands, if you took a feminist foreign policy approach, how would you get that voice? Would that be the government of the Solomon Islands actually having a new group to be able to give a voice to women who they like elect people, or is it a group like UN Women would actually support that? How do you actually support that voice? And it's tricky, like if people are anti-nuclear, you're just saying for AUKUS, you know, that's nuclear power, not nuclear arms. So yeah, so you know, when there's conflict, how is that actually managed?
Yeah, and these are not easy. There are no easy answers, and I think that all the countries that have announced a feminist foreign policy are grappling with serious questions about militarization and how to stay committed to an ethics of a feminist ethics. So that is to be premised. Feminist foreign policy in general relies strongly on civil society. So I can see the situation where a feminist foreign policy would rely solely on, for example, the Sogavara government. So it would go more directly to civil society and women's groups in the Solomon Islands. I think that a feminist foreign policy would push Australia to expand a pro-gender approach beyond aid and development, which I think, you know, the research shows that Australia is doing quite well in the area. But I think that as we're seeing with AUKUS, is being pulled in other directions when things get hard. So we could, I mean, I mentioned that there is no evidence of of Australia. So Australia is doing all this military diplomacy in the Pacific at the moment, but specifically speaking about the Solomon Islands, I haven't found any evidence that these defense projects somehow will engage with civil society. And I think that that would be a way of operationalizing a feminist foreign policy in sectors like defense. Unfortunately, this was a project that I pitched to defense. They were very interested, but they couldn't prioritize it. So, so I guess it would be more about talking and working with civil society.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It was really insightful. I'm quite interested in climate justice in the Pacific region, but obviously there's so much overlap with this. I guess my question would be, when we're talking about Australia creating feminist foreign policy for the Solomon Islands, how do cultural values kind of fit into that? And have you come across any potential mismatch between cultural norms within Australia as a Western nation and Solomon Islands that would influence the agenda, and you wouldn't really want to override, I guess, local feminist priorities with a Western one? So.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I mean, there is something to be said about the fact that in some non-Western countries, the word feminism has a baggage. And so perhaps, you know, the decision to not go for a feminist foreign policy just yet might have to do with that as well. While in the region, at least, Indigenous has more of a cachet, I would say. So a feminist foreign policy, as I was trying to say in the presentation, has intersectionality at heart, right? So it's less about claiming that it's a feminist foreign policy, and it is more about actually implementing the intersectionality of the policy. So as I said before, I like to think of a feminist foreign policy as a question, which has to do with really two parts of the question. Is this policy benefiting women? And is this policy taking into account the differences of women? So I think that if these, you know, two parts question is taken into consideration, then, you know, I can see, I mean, there shouldn't be a problem with imposing, because it's not about imposing. Actually, it's about lifting local and Pacific women.
Hi, thanks. And again, great presentation. I'm just going to build on one of the earlier questions, which is specifically about aid and development. And I wonder your thoughts where there is a project, and I speak to a project that I worked with in partnership with the Solomon Islands, where the development is actually specifically about building skills capacity amongst the defence and correctional staff workforce. So I was involved in an Australian Solomon Islands partnership to build capacity and leadership with amongst the correctional workforce, not with women as the main target, but of course, I'm a woman, and so that was a focus of my assignment, or I certainly made it one. So I'm just wondering your thoughts as to whether that could be foreign policy by stealth, to use your phrase.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't my phrase, it was Catherine Lakewood's, just to clarify. So I think you're right that that there is a bit of that focus, or I don't know if you were saying this, but I would say that there is that when it comes to thinking about gender in defense, the immediate place that policymakers go to is to train women in defense and policing, which, I mean, as a scholar who works on militarization, I think it's problematic. There are, I mean, that's an area of attention, but it can be the sole area of attention of when we're thinking about women in defense. And as I said before, I designed this project that never got funded just yet, about how can the Australian Defence support women's civil society, because that would be a way of not militarizing, or of not further militarizing women. It would be a way of providing assistance in a way that that is gender sensitive, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the recruitment of women in defense. Again, I think here it's one part of what we want to do, like as in we want to give women the opportunity to enter defense and policing, but that cannot be the whole story, because that's where we're also juggling the questions of a feminist commitment to peace and demilitarization of women. A more peaceful world should not rely on the militarization of women, I don't think.
All right, so I think we'll leave it there. Once again, please join me in thanking our speaker, Dr. Caso. For our Zoom audience, you can see me again, hello. We'll be leaving you here, but for the rest of us in the room, feel free to hang around for a little bit, have a little snack, a little drink, and mingle and chat. Thank you.
Thank you.